There are moments in life when a single decision, made in the quiet desperation of survival, can shatter every wall you've built around your heart and rewrite your entire destiny. For Maya Santos, that moment came on a rain-soaked Tuesday evening when her empty stomach led her down an alley she'd never explored before, toward a dumpster behind an abandoned warehouse, where the faint sound of knocking would pull her into a story she never imagined living. Maya was 23 years old, but her eyes carried the weariness of someone who had lived twice that long. Life had stripped her of everything: her parents in a car accident when she was 17, her college dreams dissolved into dust, her small apartment lost to debts she couldn't pay. For the past 2 years, she had been invisible, one of the countless faces sleeping in shelters, eating at soup kitchens, collecting bottles and cans to earn enough for a meal. Her clothes were donated, worn thin at the elbows. Her shoes had holes that let in the rain. But the hardest part wasn't the hunger or the cold. It was the way people looked through her, as if she didn't exist, as if her humanity had been revoked along with her address. That evening, as the city lights began to flicker on and the rain turned the streets into mirrors, Maya wandered toward the industrial district where she sometimes found discarded food from the loading docks. Her stomach twisted with hunger, and her fingers were numb despite being stuffed into the pockets of her threadbare jacket. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and hollow, its windows shattered like broken promises. She had never gone behind it before, but desperation makes explorers of us all. As she rounded the corner, picking her way through puddles and debris, she heard it. A sound so faint she almost dismissed it as her imagination. A rhythmic thumping, muffled and distant. She froze, tilting her head, and heard it again. Knocking. Someone was knocking from inside something. Her heart began to race, not with fear but with something else, something that had been sleeping inside her for too long. The instinct to help, the memory of her own humanity. She followed the sound to a large metal trunk pushed against the warehouse wall, half hidden under a torn tarp. The knocking grew frantic as she approached. Her hands shook as she pulled away the tarp and examined the trunk. It was locked, but the mechanism was old and rusted. She grabbed a piece of metal rebar from the ground and wedged it under the latch, using all her weight to pry it open. The lock broke with a snap that echoed through the alley, and she threw open the lid. Inside was a man, curled in an impossible position, his expensive suit torn and filthy, his face bruised and swollen. But it was his eyes that struck her first, wide with terror and relief, darting across her face as if searching for something. He was older than her, perhaps in his late 30s, with the kind of features that spoke of boardrooms and first-class flights. Even in his current state, there was an elegance to him that seemed out of place in this forgotten corner of the city. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. She helped him sit up, her small hands surprisingly strong as she supported his weight. He winced with every movement, and she could see his wrists were bound with zip ties. She used the edge of the rebar to cut through them, her movements careful despite her own trembling. When he was free, he collapsed forward, gasping for air, his body shaking with what might have been sobs or simply exhaustion. Maya didn't ask questions. She didn't demand explanations. She simply knelt beside him in the rain and waited until his breathing steadied. When he finally looked up at her again, his eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. He stared at her as if he'd seen a ghost, his expression shifting from shock to something else, something she couldn't name. His hand reached up slowly, trembling, and he touched the side of her face so gently she barely felt it. The man's name was Alexander Cross, though Maya wouldn't learn this for several more minutes. What she couldn't know, was that Alexander was the heir to a vast fortune, the CEO of a multinational corporation, and that 3 days earlier he had been kidnapped from his penthouse by men who wanted his company's secrets and his family's money. What she also didn't know was that the face she wore, the face that had seemed so ordinary to her for 23 years, was identical to the face of Alexander's younger sister, the sister who had died 15 years ago in the same accident that should have killed him too. When he could finally speak, his first words weren't a plea for help or a thank you. They were a whispered name. Sophia. His voice cracked on the syllable, and tears began to stream down his dirty face. Maya pulled back, confused and frightened. She shook her head and told him her name, but he kept staring, kept touching her face as if she might disappear. He told her she looked exactly like his sister, exactly like the girl who had been 12 years old when the drunk driver's car had crossed the median and changed everything. Maya helped him to his feet, and together they stumbled out of the alley. She took him to the only place she knew might be safe, a small community church 3 blocks away where the pastor sometimes let her sleep on cold nights. The pastor called the police, and within an hour, the alley was swarming with officers and paramedics. Alexander was taken to the hospital, and Maya tried to slip away into the night, back to her invisible existence. But Alexander grabbed her hand before she could go. He pressed a business card into her palm, one that had somehow survived his ordeal, and he made her promise to come see him. She nodded, not believing she ever would, and disappeared into the rain. But Alexander Cross was not a man who forgot debts or dismissed miracles. While he recovered in a private hospital room, surrounded by family and security, he hired investigators to find everything they could about Maya Santos. What they discovered broke his heart in ways the kidnapping never could. They found records of her parents' death, her financial collapse, the string of bad luck and worse timing that had pushed her onto the streets. They found a girl who had once been a student with dreams of becoming a teacher, who volunteered at animal shelters and wrote poetry in spiral notebooks. They found someone who had been swallowed by circumstances and forgotten by a system that was supposed to catch people before they fell. 10 days after Maya saved his life, Alexander showed up at the shelter where she was staying. She almost didn't recognize him, clean and healed, wearing a casual sweater and jeans that probably cost more than some people's cars. He asked if they could talk, and something in his voice, something vulnerable and honest, made her agree. They walked to a nearby coffee shop, and he bought her the first real meal she'd had in weeks. Over coffee and sandwiches, he told her everything. About his sister Sophia, about the accident that had killed her and left him with survivor's guilt that had haunted him for 15 years. About how seeing Maya's face in that trunk had felt like a message from somewhere beyond, a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd spent his life running from. He told her he wanted to help her, and Maya's first instinct was to refuse. Pride is sometimes all that poverty leaves us. And she'd clung to hers like a life raft. But Alexander didn't offer her pity. He offered her a chance. He said he'd been thinking about starting a foundation in his sister's name, something that helped young people who'd fallen through society's cracks get back on their feet. He wanted Maya to be part of building it, not as a charity case but as someone who understood what that help actually meant. He would pay for her to finish her education, help her find housing, give her a job in his organization. In return, she would help him design programs that actually worked, that saw people like her as human beings rather than statistics. Maya wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. She asked him why he cared, why he would do all this for a stranger. Alexander looked at her with those same intense eyes from the alley and told her the truth. He said that finding her, being saved by someone who had every reason to walk past that trunk and keep going, had reminded him what real strength looked like. He said that seeing Sophia's face again, even in someone else, had forced him to confront the guilt and grief he'd been burying under work and wealth. He said she hadn't just saved his life, she'd reminded him why life was worth living in the first place. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Maya moved into a small apartment that Alexander's foundation rented for her. She started therapy to process her trauma and grief. She enrolled in community college classes to finish her degree. She worked part-time at the foundation's office, learning how nonprofits operated, meeting other people who were rebuilding their lives from rubble. There were hard days when the old darkness crept in, when she felt like an imposter in her new life, when she wanted to run back to the streets where at least the rules made sense. But Alexander was patient. He checked in regularly, not as a benefactor but as a friend. He shared his own struggles with her, his ongoing therapy, his complicated relationship with his wealthy family who had never understood his grief. Over months and then years, Maya and Alexander built something neither had expected. The Sophia Cross Foundation became one of the most effective homeless intervention programs in the city, known for treating clients with dignity and providing comprehensive support. Maya finished her bachelor's degree and then her master's in social work. She became the foundation's director of programs, the architect of initiatives that helped hundreds of people transition off the streets. She spoke at conferences and testified before city councils. She became a voice for the voiceless, powerful precisely because she'd once had no power at all. But more than that, she and Alexander had become each other's family. He walked her down the aisle when she eventually married a kind social worker she'd met through the foundation. She stood beside him when he finally scattered Sophia's ashes in the ocean, finding peace after all those years. They celebrated holidays together, weathered losses together, built a chosen family that understood what it meant to save and be saved. Years later, when Maya stood in front of a crowd at the Foundation's 10th anniversary gala, she told the story of that rainy night in the alley. She talked about the girl she'd been, hungry and invisible, who'd heard knocking and chosen to answer. She talked about the man in the trunk whose face had shown her that she still mattered, that her actions could still change the world. She explained that we all carry trunks inside us, locked places where we've hidden our pain and fear and shame. And sometimes, she said, salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, from people society has discarded, from moments of choice. That seems small but ripple outward into everything. Alexander sat in the front row that night, tears streaming down his face, and when Maya finished speaking, he stood and applauded until his hands hurt. Because he understood something that most people never learn, that saving and being saved are not separate acts but two sides of the same miracle, that the face of grace often looks nothing like we expect, and that sometimes the poorest among us are the richest in the things that actually matter. Maya's story is a reminder that your circumstances do not define your worth. That a hungry girl with holes in her shoes can be exactly the hero someone needs. That the choice to help, even when you have nothing, is the most powerful choice of all. That faces can haunt us and heal us, that grief can transform into purpose, and that sometimes the life you save saves you right back. So if you've felt invisible today, if you've doubted your value or your ability to make a difference, remember Maya. Remember that she was hungry and cold and forgotten, and she still opened that trunk. Remember that your next small act of kindness might be the beginning of someone's transformation, or your own. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own power to change lives, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because stories like this, stories of real redemption and unexpected grace, are the ones we all need to hear. Thank you for listening, and remember, you are never too broken to be someone's miracle.